Welcome, my friend, to a new episode of Frameworks. And in this episode, we're going to talk about a language framework. And when we talk about a language framework, it means that we can use it for teaching vocabulary, grammar, function, pronunciation, and discourse. And in this episode, we're going to talk about text-based presentation. But what do we mean by text-based presentation? Well, actually, text-based presentation, as the name tells, it is teaching language through a text. And this text could be spoken or could be written. And my friends, as Jeremy Harmer says in his wonderful work, Essential Teacher Knowledge, he says, all texts, whether spoken or written, are gold mines full of language. And of course, he means by this that any text is full of a lot of linguistic features that can be used by teachers and students can develop. So texts are amazing. And this is the beauty of what we're going to study in this episode, text-based presentation. So let's see the stages of this framework and how I use these stages in creating my own lesson of authentic material. Let's see. So my friends, this framework, as other frameworks, start with the stage of leading. And as we said before, the reason why we always start our frameworks with a leading stage is because it's very important at the very beginning of the lesson to attract your students' attention. This is how you get them involved. This is how you make them interested in the lesson and you make them love it. And when students are interested in the lesson, then learning becomes super easy, eh? Right, good. Now, so leading is the first stage. Now let me show you how I designed a leading stage for my lesson. First, this is what I did. I actually visited a website and I found an interesting text. This website page says 18 pretty revenge stories that will give you some pretty sinister ideas. Interesting. So actually what I did is that I took a couple of stories. Let me show you what I did. So I took a couple of stories. Story number 1 and story number 2. And both the stories are actually about revenge. So finally, this means that my topic is revenge, which means that leading has to be about the topic of revenge. So let's see what I did with the leading stage. And actually, my leading stage is made up of 2 questions. Question number 1 is, have you ever decided to do a revenge on someone you work with? Why? And number 2, have you ever done a revenge on someone you barely know? Why? So 2 questions. Have you ever decided to do a revenge on someone you work with? Why? And have you ever done a revenge on someone you barely know? Why? Good. So this was my first stage, which is leading. And of course, as we said, leading has to be around the topic. And as long as we're using text-based presentation, so there will be a text. So you need to look carefully at the topic of the text and design your leading. Now, the second stage in the text-based presentation framework is what we call, my friends, exposure. Well, some people call it reading. And I actually prefer the term exposure. Why? Because when we call it reading, that might give the wrong impression that the rationale behind this stage is to make students' reading skills better, which is untrue in this scenario. Because in text-based presentation, we're coming to teach language, not skills. So actually, this stage, which might be called by some people reading, but as I said, I prefer calling it exposure for a reason, is because the main rationale behind this stage is to expose the students to the target language. And someone might say, but Shadi, why do we need to expose the students to the target language in a text? It's because simply, my friend, language in reality appears in texts, whether these texts are spoken text or reading text. But this is how we encounter language most of the time. So the best way to show students how language works is to show them how language works in a text, whether it's spoken or written. And this is the beauty of this stage, which we call exposure, that is, students are exposed to the target language unconsciously. Someone might say, what do you mean by unconsciously here? And I mean by that they don't know that they're studying grammar or pronunciation or vocabulary or discourse or function. They don't know, they're not aware. You just give them the text and you give them a reading question. So some students might think that it's just a normal reading question, while actually you want to show them language in action. And this is why we call it exposure. And my friends, as Stephen Krashen puts it, those who read more write better. And we know that writing is directly connected to grammar, because how do you write? You structure the language. You build the language when you write. Now, according to Krashen, those who read more, they write better, which means there is better acquisition of grammatical structure when you read. And this is, again, this is a plus to the text-based presentation framework, because look at it. Students read a text, they see the language in action, and of course, reading will help them acquire the structure according to Krashen. Wonderful. So the first stage now is leading, and then the second stage is exposure. Now, how did I design an exposure task for my lesson? Let's see. Now, it is very important to answer a question here. Now, what is my exposure task then? And here is my question. Read the following revenge stories and come up with a suitable title for each story. So it's a kind of a reading for just activity. They read the story, they come up with a title, and this is my exposure stage. And what do I mean by exposure? As I said before, students can see the present simple used here to express past. But I don't say anything about the present simple. I don't say anything. I just let them read. Okay, and this is the exposure stage. Now, in my lesson, what is the language that I need my students to be exposed to? And actually, the language I want them to be exposed to in this scenario is what we call the graphic use of the present simple. I want you to learn how to use the present simple for telling stories. Okay, right. So let's have a look at the first story. Look at what it says. I had two jobs. One was at this country ice house in nowhere outside of my city. I worked the door, checked IDs and such, and usually broke up fights or kicked people out. One night, some trouble happens. Look at this present simple. One night, some trouble happens between some regulars. And one guy tries, present simple again, tries to hit another guy with a pool stick. I happened to get hit in the arm, but got behind the guy and put him to sleep. Next day, the manager calls, present simple again. So, again, this is what I want to teach my students. I want to teach them that present simple can be used to tell stories in the past, which is an advanced usage of present simple. So you may teach this at the advanced level. Wonderful. So this is now my target language. Wonderful. Now, what is the third stage? And the third stage in the text-based presentation framework is what we call highlighting. Now, what do we mean by highlighting? Well, as the name tells, it's about highlighting language in your text for students. And someone might say, Shadi, why didn't you call it teaching? Yeah, because it's not teaching. Why didn't you call it presenter or clarification? Well, because it's not presenting, it's not clarification, it's just highlighting. And in the highlighting stage, all I want is to make my students notice how my target language works in text. And noticing is very, very important for acquiring grammatical structures, as Richard Schmidt, the famous linguist, said. Learners cannot learn the grammatical features of a language unless they notice them. Noticing alone does not mean that learners will acquire language automatically. The hypothesis states that noticing is the essential starting point for acquisition. Now, so Schmidt says that noticing is very important, and look at the beauty of the word noticing. It's not teaching. Just try to design activity that makes them notice, that makes them see how language works before teaching. Right, and let's see how I did this in my highlighting stage. Let's go. Now, as you see in my highlighting stage, I went to my stories, and whenever I see a present simple used, I put another option, which is past simple. So look at this, for example. One night, some trouble happened, happens. One guy tried. Next day, the manager called. And then my question was, read the two stories again and try to remember the verb form used. So this is kind of a memory activity. And of course, I will ask my students to put the first text away. Now they need to remember which verb was used. Was it present simple or past simple? If they're going to answer this based on their previous experience or previous learning, they'll go for past simple because it makes sense, because they see that the story is in the past, so they're going to use it. But if they remember the text that they've just read, they're going to go for present simple. And that's the noticing part here, because they're going to ask now themselves, what was it? Was it really present simple? And if they're going to say present simple, they're going to say, but why is it used here when it's supposed to be past simple, because we're talking about the past? And this is what I want. I want this kind of argument inside their heads. Is it present simple? Is it past simple? Because this will help the noticing process that Schmidt talked about. Now, so the first stage is leading, now exposure, now highlighting. Now, what is the fourth stage now? It is what we call language clarification. And in language clarification, three things need to be covered: meaning, pronunciation, and form. But think about this, my friends. This is a lesson to be taught to the advanced students. And of course, with advanced students, do I need to focus on the form of the present simple? No, simply because they studied that form at the elementary level, the beginner level, the elementary level, the pre-intermediate level, the intermediate level, the upper intermediate level, so it's over. There is no need to focus on form here. Also, there is no need to focus on the pronunciation of the present simple for this level of students. Why? Because it has already been covered in all previous levels before. So that would be really redundant. My students would be really bored if I focused on that. Then the most important thing in this lesson is meaning, because this is the new part. Because meaning here would be weird to some students. Why present simple is used to tell stories in the past? That's new. So this is the focus. So how Did I clarify language? There are three ways through which we can clarify language: direct teaching, guided discovery, and self-directed discovery. Now, what I used here was actually guided discovery. And I linked my guided discovery presentation with actually the feedback to the noticing stage or the highlighting stage. So for example, students say, one night some trouble happens. And then I ask my students, yeah, that's the correct answer. But wait a minute, why happens here? Are we talking about past, present, or future? And then he would say, no, we're talking about the past. So I would ask them, and why do you think present simple is used then to talk about the past? And I expect them to pause at this question a bit and think about it. And then I would say, actually, that's a correct usage, but it's kind of an informal usage, not a formal one. Okay, and then I'll go, one guy tries or tried to hit another guy. Which one do you think was mentioned? Yeah, it's tries. Well, that's true, it's tries here. But are we talking again about past or present? We're talking about present, so that's kind of the same usage. And this would be the way I'm going to explain to them that kind of usage. And as I said, I don't need to talk here about form, I don't need to talk about pronunciation. My students are already strong at this. Right, now, the normal coming stage in the text-based presentation after language clarification is what we call practice. And practice, as we know, is divided into two parts: controlled practice and freer practice. Controlled practice is to focus on accuracy, while freer practice focuses on fluency. Controlled practice is characterized by limited production of language, while freer practice is characterized by free production of language. Controlled practice is also characterized by predicted language, while freer practice is characterized by unpredicted language. What do we mean by this exactly? Let's see the activities I designed and talked about the practice stage together. And here we are. 7. Look at activity 7. Read the following revenge joke and rewrite it using the graphic present simple. Now I call this a controlled practice. Why? Because the students are not going to come up with their own language. So here, language is predicted, very predicted. I know that they're going to write the same story, they're just going to change the past simple maybe into present simple in some parts, but nothing more. So here, the language production is so limited because they're going just to change some verbs from past to present. And also language is so predicted because I know already the story that they're going to come up with or they're going to edit. And this is why we call this a controlled practice. And here, of course, it's obvious that the focus is on accuracy, because all I'm trying to do now is to check whether they can change this, story so that it is told in the present simple, to see whether they're able to use it this way. Now let's move to activity 8, and it says, think of one of the following: film, story, joke, or a book you know well, and write down some notes. Tell your partner about it using the graphic present. So now they're going to tell a film, a story, joke, or a book using the graphic present. Now, I don't know what they will choose. So this is unpredicted language. And even if I know that they will choose a film, I don't know which film, I don't know which language they will use to tell the story of the film. So this is unpredicted language. And also, I have no idea how much they will produce in terms of speaking. So this is unlimited language production as well. And the focus here, of course, is not on accuracy. The focus is on fluency. Yes, using the graphic present, but it's still fluency. And this is, my friends, what we call the practice stage. So the practice stage is divided into two parts: controlled practice followed by freer practice. And it has to be controlled practice first. Because as we said before, it makes sense to move from what is easier to what is more challenging. And controlled practice activities are easier. So they prepare students for the more challenging activity, the freer practice task. Now, finally, after the practice stage is over, we move now to what we call feedback. And as we said in all the previous episodes, two kinds of feedback: content feedback, language feedback. And on content feedback, you focus on the content, the ideas. So you say to someone, tell me about the film your friends talked about, and try to use the graphic present when you're telling me. So you're asking about ideas now. In actually the language feedback, you will focus on accuracy. So whether students were able to use the graphic present simple accurately or not. So thank you very much, my friends, for watching again this episode. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the coming episode, we'll be talking about the TTT, the Test, Teach, Test framework for teaching language. Thank you very much for watching the episode. This was Shadi Abu Yusuf from Britishey Training Center. Bye bye, my friends.